The third argument for increasing population is that this will make Australia a bigger country and that we should aspire to a big Australia. This argument is harder to understand than an episode of Lost. Australia is already a big country. Bringing more people to Australia means there is less room for us as individuals. We lose our backyards and get cooped up in high-rises. In my book, that makes a place smaller. A big country is one we can share with koalas and kookaburras and platypus and wombats and lyrebirds. A big country is one with wide open spaces where you can drive for miles and hear yourself think. If you drive up or down Australia's eastern seaboard now, it's all suburbs and traffic lights and retail franchises. That's not a bigger country, it's a shrinking one. The fourth argument for increasing our population is that other countries have. Australia is not overcrowded compared to other countries, it is said, and our cities are not overcrowded compared to other cities around the world. Recently we were told to have a look at Bangladesh. We have, believe me, we have. We don't want to live in Bangladesh. With the greatest of respect, that's the whole bloody point. The population of Bangladesh has doubled since 1971, from 75 million to 150 million. Needless to say, its per-person GDP is miserable. Just $421 for the whole year 2003-04. It is one of the poorest countries in the world with severe deficiencies in its health and nutrition services. And yes, Australian cities are less crowded than many of those overseas. But what is this cultural cringe which causes us to believe that Australia and the Australian way of life are somehow inferior to those of other countries and other cities? If Australia is not as good a place to live as other countries, how come so many people are busting their backsides to get here? When we start seeing boatloads of people leaving Australia, then it'll be time to start thinking about where we're going wrong. In the meantime, why don't we celebrate Australia and its way of life and seek to protect it? The fifth argument for increasing population, one I recently heard from a former Howard government minister, is that this will give us more weight in international forums. By this he means more power and influence. But power for its own sake is overrated. The power and influence that I want for Australia is the power and influence which comes from setting a good example, keeping open spaces for our unique native wildlife, keeping our food, water and housing affordable and our cities safe and livable, having room for refugees and a generous overseas aid program, cutting our carbon footprint. These are the things which will provide leadership to the world and give us real weight. The sixth argument for increasing population relates specifically to migration and says that a high migration policy is evidence of our compassion and is a duty we owe to peoples around the world less fortunate than ourselves. I am personally strongly in favour of Australia being a compassionate international citizen, and I've proposed a 45% increase in our refugee intake from 13,750 to 20,000, and that we maintain our family reunion intake at 50,000 per annum. But the skilled migration program cannot be defended as Australia's obligation to the world. Skilled migrants are claimed to be bringing to Australia skills we don't have. To the extent that they are skilled, they are actually denuding the countries from which they come. This is not Australia being compassionate, this is us being selfish. Moreover, I think we should be wary of appeals to our better nature when the outcome of those appeals is not a better Australia or a better world, and when those appealing to us to be unselfish are in fact being utterly selfish themselves, putting their corporate bottom line and personal financial interests ahead of everything else. It is utterly insincere of business or political leaders or commentators to call on Australians to make sacrifices in the shape of water restrictions, reducing our carbon emissions, paying more for food, housing, water and petrol, having less say in planning decisions about the neighbourhood in which we live, when the value of these various hardships is absolutely undone by increasing population. I am not in favour of selfishness in the pursuit of ever greater material wealth. I'm not in favour of greed. I'm not in favour of ripping off and exploiting those less fortunate than ourselves. But I believe we are entitled to protect our standard of living and the Australian way of life. Don't be conned into giving these things up by appeals to selflessness made with all the sincerity of a Mississippi riverboat gambler. The last myth coming from population boosters that I want to mention is that it will all take care of itself. Yes, population is rising now, they say, but soon it will level off and stabilise of its own accord. Extreme versions of this even claim that in future our population will fall. For a long time I thought there was something in this. The realisation that all the past projections of population numbers were gross underestimates and that this problem is not going to solve itself is a key reason why I've started calling publicly for population reform. Back in 1984, the World Bank's population projection for the year 2100 was 21 million. We reached that in 2007. A decade ago, forecasters were predicting we wouldn't hit the 22 million mark until 2040. We're there already. 2 years ago, Treasury's intergenerational report predicted Australia would be 28 million by 2049. Within just 2 years, they'd revised that figure upwards by 25% to 35 million. So the idea that population growth is a problem that will one day solve itself is also a myth. Having refuted the arguments in favour of population, the next political challenge is to come up with an alternative. As well as addressing those who think that population growth is desirable, we have to address those who think that it's inevitable. They don't believe anything can be done about it. They think it's out of control. We have to point out that some countries have done it, so we can too. And we need to have an alternative. 2 weeks ago, I set out a 14-point plan for population reform. The heart of this plan is a proposal to stabilise Australia's population at 26 million by 2050 by cutting net overseas migration to 70,000 per annum. While refugee numbers would increase and family reunion numbers would be held constant, skilled migration would return to the 25,000 figure of the mid-1990s. Temporary entry subclass 457 visa permits would be restricted. A renewed focus on educating, skilling and training young Australians at universities, TAFEs and with apprenticeships would receive a funding boost with money obtained from abolishing the baby bonus and limiting family payments for third and subsequent children to those already receiving them. The policy I released generated a certain amount of controversy in New Zealand because it proposed a cap on the presently uncapped Trans-Tasman scheme. So I did some more work on this, and the formula I propose in fact would not have prevented any New Zealanders wishing to migrate to Australia from doing so in any of the years that I looked at, which were the 4 years from 2004-5 to 2007-8. You might ask why I put the cap in place and why I've kept it when it doesn't seem to have any practical impact. The reason is this. When I propose stabilising the population through 70,000 net annual migration, I can be asked, but you don't know how many people are going to leave Australia in any given year, and I'd have to admit that I don't. And I can be asked, and you don't know how many people are going to come to Australia from New Zealand in any given year, do you? And I'd have to admit that I don't. So I can be challenged that, given this, I simply couldn't guarantee a net 70,000 or indeed any figure. So the point of having a cap and linking New Zealand arrivals to Australian departures is that it will give us control over our net migration figure, and it is an essential ingredient in delivering a population policy. And indeed, there may be circumstances where the level of departures from Australia or the level of applicants from New Zealand necessitates the application of a cap. The fourth political challenge is to have a strategy. There are a number of elements of such a strategy that I want to suggest this afternoon. The first is about unity. To succeed in any political endeavour, you have to work cooperatively. There is some recent evidence of this. There has to be some give and take. People will naturally have differences of opinion about particular points, although I've been delighted by the degree of support I've received for important elements of my plan, such as increasing the refugee intake while at the same time greatly reducing the overall migration program. We need to respect differences of opinion and keep nitpicking about detail to a minimum. When you're up against what we're up against, it's a luxury we can't afford.